Rain fell in slanting needles over Stalag Luft III on the night of March 24th, 1944, not heavy enough to drown sound, but thick enough to cloak movement. The kind of drizzle that slicked the watchtower rungs and turned the compound chalky soil into a sucking paste beneath boots. The temperature hovered just above freezing, the air sharp with the tang of wet pine and coal smoke from the commandantur's chimney and from my post on Tower 2. I could hear the rhythmic creak of the sentry box hinges as Corporal Voss shifted his weight, muttering about frostbite and the uselessness of British officers who couldn't even surrender properly. My name was Erich Hoffmann, and I was not a soldier in any meaningful sense, just a 21-year-old conscript from Leipzig, assigned to perimeter guard duty because my flat feet disqualified me for frontline service and my handwriting was deemed too neat for clerical work. I'd been issued a bolt-action Mauser, a wool greatcoat that smelled of mothballs and damp wool, and a pair of instructions so vague they amounted to, "Don't let anyone leave." The camp sprawled beneath me, a grid of low barracks fenced in triple strands of barbed wire strung between wooden posts, lit by weak sodium lamps that cast amber halos in the mist, turning shadows into liquid pools. Beyond the wire, the Sagan forest began, a dense belt of spruce and birch that swallowed light whole. Every 90 seconds I swept my binoculars across the yard, not because I expected anything, but because routine had calcified into ritual, and ritual was the only thing keeping us all from unraveling in this godforsaken stretch of Lower Silesia. I'd noticed it 3 nights earlier, a flicker of distortion near Barracks 104, not movement exactly, but a shimmer in the air like heat haze off summer asphalt, except it was March, and the ground was half frozen. At first, I thought it was fatigue. I'd been pulling double shifts since the commandant tightened security after the last escape attempt in January, the one where they tunneled under the latrine and emerged 20 meters short of the tree line before a patrol dog caught their scent. But the shimmer returned the next night, and the next, always between 23 and 01, always in the same quadrant, near the eastern gable where the drainage ditch ran shallow beneath the barracks foundation. It wasn't until I trained my field glasses on that spot during a lull in the rain that I saw it. Not a man, not a tool, but a breath. Condensation rising in a thin, steady plume from the earth itself, as if the ground were exhaling. And then I understood. They weren't tunneling out through the forest. They were tunneling up from below the barracks through the soil and out somewhere beyond the wire, but the entrance had to be hidden so deep, so perfectly disguised, that even the guards who walked past it twice a day never suspected the earth beneath their boots was hollow. I mentioned it to Sergeant Kessler the next morning over weak ersatz coffee in the mess tent. He didn't look up from his newspaper. "Hoffmann, if every twitch in your eyelid meant an escape, we'd have no prisoners left. Those Tommies talk big, but they're soft. Cold, bored, and soft." He flicked ash from his cigarette onto the floorboards. "Besides, the seismographs would have picked up digging. The engineers checked the foundations last week, solid as bedrock." I didn't argue. Arguing with Kessler was like shouting into a well, but I kept watching. And on the night of the 24th, as the rain thickened and the compound lights dimmed for curfew, I saw something new, a faint tremor in the puddle at the base of Barracks 104's eastern wall, not from wind, not from a boot, but from below, a subterranean ripple. And then, just after 23:30, a shadow detached itself from the barracks silhouette, not crawling, not running, but flowing like spilled ink across the mud toward the outer wire. My finger hovered over the alarm bell. Protocol demanded I sound it immediately, but something in the way that figure moved, silent, precise, utterly unhurried, made me hesitate. This wasn't a panicked dash. This was the culmination of months, maybe years of planning. And in that suspended second, I did what no German guard had ever done. I lowered my binoculars, turned my back to the compound, and pretended to adjust the focus on my field glasses, giving the shadow just enough time to vanish into the tree line before I noticed the disturbance and called it in, 10 minutes too late. The escape was real. Not one man, but 76. They dug 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, over 14 months, using spoons, bed slats, and stolen electrical wire. Harry was the one that broke the surface beyond the wire, its entrance concealed beneath a trapdoor made of plywood and dirt, camouflaged with moss and fallen needles. The men emerged one by one into the rain-slicked darkness, dressed in civilian clothes, stitched from blankets and dyed with tea leaves, carrying forged papers and compasses hidden in shirt buttons. I never learned which one I'd seen that night, but I knew, with a cold certainty that settled in my bones like damp, that I'd let him go. Not out of sympathy, though God knows I'd grown weary of the hollow cruelty of this war, but because I recognized in that silent, disciplined exodus something I hadn't seen in years: competence, purpose, a will to act despite impossible odds. The camp erupted at dawn. Dogs bayed, motorcycles roared onto the roads, searchlights carved the forest into jagged columns of white. By noon, 50 were recaptured, but 23 vanished into the Reich, and 3, just 3, made it to neutral territory. The Gestapo executed 50 of the recaptured officers on Hitler's direct order, a crime so brazen it shocked even hardened SS men. I was interrogated twice, accused of negligence, perhaps collusion, but my record was clean, my alibi flimsy but plausible, and with the Eastern Front collapsing, Berlin had bigger worries than one absent-minded guard in Sagan. Yet the truth coiled inside me like a wire under tension. I hadn't just looked away, I'd chosen. And that choice, small as it seemed in the moment, had cracked something open in me, something I couldn't unsee. The prisoners weren't enemies. They were men like me, trapped in a machine that ground down decency into obedience. In the weeks that followed, I watched the camp change. The officers grew quieter, their eyes harder. The guards grew more brutal, as if punishing the earth itself for letting hope escape through its soil. I stopped sleeping. Every raindrop on the watchtower roof sounded like footsteps. Every gust through the pines carried whispers in English. And then, in late April, came the order: dismantle barracks 104, dig up the entire perimeter, pour concrete over every inch of soft earth. They found Tom and Dick, collapsed, half-flooded, but Harry's entrance point was never recovered. The earth had swallowed it whole, or perhaps it had simply healed itself around the wound, as if the land itself had conspired with the escapees. I was reassigned to a supply depot near Dresden that summer, but the image never left me. That breath rising from the mud, that shadow slipping into the trees, and the terrible, liberating silence that followed when I chose not to sound the alarm. Dresden in August 1944 smelled of scorched brick and burnt sugar. The confectioners near the Altmarkt had taken to boiling down beet syrup for ersatz jam, and the scent clung to the air like a ghost of normalcy. I was stationed at Depot 17, a converted textile warehouse stacked with crates of boots, radio valves, and tinned sauerkraut destined for the Eastern Front, though fewer and fewer trains seemed to reach their destinations. My duties were simple: log incoming shipments, verify manifests, stamp papers with a rubber date stamper that left faint blue smudges on my thumbs. It should have been a reprieve from Sagan, a quiet post far from barbed wire and the haunted eyes of prisoners. But sleep still eluded me. At night, I dreamed of tunnels, not the damp, claustrophobic shafts beneath Barracks 104, but vast, echoing corridors stretching beneath cities, beneath borders, beneath the very idea of nations, all of them humming with the quiet footsteps of men who refused to be buried alive by war. I stopped speaking much. The other clerks thought me sullen. The sergeant assumed I was nursing a fever. In truth, I was nursing a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. I had aided an enemy escape. However passively, and in doing so, I had betrayed not my country. But the illusion that obedience was virtue, the war on paper, was unraveling faster than the Reich could falsify it. Supply requisitions came stamped with ever more desperate priority codes, dringend, so fort. But the trains that arrived carried half loads or empty boxcars with bullet holes in their siding. One afternoon, while sorting crates marked Funkrit 16 ZY, fighter intercom sets for BF 109s, I found a crate lined not with foam padding, but with pages from an English-language railway timetable. Dated 1938, someone had used it as packing material, perhaps scavenged from a bombed-out office in Berlin. The pages were brittle, ink faded, but the routes were clear: London to Dover, Manchester to Liverpool, Glasgow to Inverness. I traced the lines with my finger, imagining men like those from Stalag Luft III navigating those tracks in stolen coats, hearts pounding at every stationmaster's glance. Then I saw it, a tiny notation in pencil in the margin beside the Edinburgh-Aberdeen line, almost invisible. H. Safe. May 3. I froze. H, could it be? Flight Lieutenant Headley? I'd overheard his name during roll call back at the camp. A quiet man with spectacles, an engineer by trade, who'd once repaired a broken stove in the guards' mess without being asked. He was among the 76, and if this note was real, he'd made it to Scotland. My hands trembled as I tucked the page into my tunic pocket, beneath the lining where the stitching had frayed. It was evidence, perhaps of nothing, but it felt like a lifeline thrown across the North Sea. I began collecting fragments. A Dutch resistance leaflet slipped into a crate of Dutch cheese. How it got there, no one knew. A scrap of RAF parachute silk wrapped around a broken radio coil, its weave unmistakable, its blue still vibrant against the grime of the depot. A coded message scratched into a wooden pallet in what looked like Morse, though I couldn't decipher it. None of it was actionable. None of it would ever be reported. But each piece confirmed a truth I'd begun to suspect. The escape hadn't just been about freedom. It had been a node in a larger network, a spark that had landed in dry tinder across occupied Europe. The Allies weren't just rescuing their own. They were using every returned airman as a source of intelligence, every safe house as a relay point, every forged identity as a crack in the Reich's armor. And I, Erich Hoffmann, warehouse clerk with flat feet and a guilty conscience, had helped one of them slip through. Then came the letter. Not addressed to me, of course not, but left in the depot's mail bin, misrouted from some administrative backlog, stamped with the insignia of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. It was a summary of the Stalag Luft III escape inquiry, copies sent to all regional logistics commands for situational awareness. Most of it was redacted, but one paragraph remained legible. Forensic analysis confirms Tunnel Harry utilized advanced soil displacement techniques, including sawdust ventilation and wooden shoring with interlocking joints, methods inconsistent with ad hoc improvisation. Recommend heightened scrutiny of incoming timber shipments at all POW camps. My breath caught. They were still looking, still hunting. And if they traced the sawdust sourced from carpentry workshops inside the camp or the specific joinery technique, they might reconstruct the entire operation, identify collaborators among the guards, perhaps even uncover the civilian networks that had aided the escapees once they left the wire. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into my coat, and that night, by the dim glow of a blackout curtained window, I burned it in a tin can. Watching the edges curl into ash that smelled of pine and regret, autumn deepened. The air raids grew more frequent, though Dresden remained oddly untouched, as if spared by some cruel irony. I started taking walks after curfew, not far, just to the edge of the city, where the Elbe shimmered under moonlight and the ruins of old factories stood like broken teeth against the skyline. One evening near the Augustus Bridge, I saw a man in a long coat feeding pigeons. He moved with a certain stiffness, a slight limp in his right leg, and when he turned, I recognized the face from a grainy photo pinned to the camp bulletin board after the escape. Squadron leader Roger Bushell, the mastermind of the Great Escape. But Bushell had been executed by the Gestapo in late March. This man couldn't be him. Yet the resemblance was uncanny. The angle of the jaw, the way he tucked his chin when scanning the horizon. My pulse hammered. Was it a double? A ghost? Or had someone survived the purge and made it this far? I followed at a distance, heart in my throat, until he disappeared into a doorway marked Buchhandlung Meyer. I never went inside. I didn't dare, but the next day, I left the railway timetable scrap, carefully folded, the H, safe notation visible beneath a potted fern outside the shop. A message in a bottle, tossed into an ocean I couldn't navigate. I never returned to that street, but weeks later, walking past the same spot, I saw the fern had been replaced with a small pot of ivy, and tucked into its leaves was a matchbook from a Zurich hotel, the cover blank except for a single symbol, a bird in flight. The war was shrinking around us. Rations thinned, uniforms frayed. Even the radio broadcasts from Berlin began to sound brittle, their triumphalism tinged with the static of denial. I stopped counting the days. Instead, I counted the silences, the pauses between air raid sirens, the gaps in official reports, the unspoken understanding between civilians that the end was coming, not with a bang but with a slow, suffocating exhale. And in those silences, I heard the echo of that rainy night in Sagan, the soft sigh of earth giving way, the whisper of a man choosing life over captivity, and my own breath held as I turned away. I had not pulled a trigger, not forged a document, not dug a single meter of tunnel. But I had withheld a truth, and in a regime built on total control, even the smallest omission could be an act of rebellion. I carried that knowledge like a pebble in my shoe, unseen, unremarkable, but impossible to ignore. Winter came early in 1945, not with snow at first, but with a greasy, metallic fog that rolled in off the Elbe and clung to the cobblestones like a shroud. By January, the temperature had plunged to -15, and the depot's ink froze in its bottles, forcing us to warm manifests over stoves before we could stamp them. Food was down to watery turnip soup and black bread so dense it could blunt a knife. Yet the shipments kept coming, not of boots or radios now, but of strange, unmarked crates labeled only with alphanumeric codes and sealed with wax stamped with the eagle and swastika of the Reichsforschungsrat. One afternoon, while helping unload a freight car from Peenemünde, I pried open a splintered crate out of sheer curiosity during a lull in supervision. Inside, nestled in excelsior, were dozens of cylindrical glass vials, each no longer than a finger, filled with a viscous amber liquid. A label in precise Gothic script read, Sauerstoffverzögerer Typ C, nicht schütteln. Oxygen retardant Type C, experimental, do not shake. I knew enough chemistry from school to recognize it as a stabilizer for liquid oxygen used in rocket propulsion. But why ship it to a logistics depot in Dresden? The V2 program was centered farther west, unless they were decentralizing production, scattering components across the Reich like seeds before a storm. I closed the crate, heart-pounding, and reported nothing. But that night, I sketched the crate's markings in the margins of my ration ledger, along with the train number and time of arrival. The city was changing. Refugees poured in from the east, women with hollow eyes and children wrapped in blankets that had once been curtains. Men missing limbs or uniforms or both, all of them speaking in hushed, frantic tones about the Ivans, how they burned villages, how they raped without distinction, how they advanced not like an army but like a tide. Fear, once abstract, had become tactile. I saw it in the way shopkeepers barred their doors at dusk, in the way mothers clutched their children tighter on the tram, in the way even the party officials began glancing over their shoulders. And yet, amid the dread, something else stirred, a quiet, furtive hope. Whispers passed in breadlines. The Americans were in Belgium. The British had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were at the Oder. The Reich was being squeezed from three sides, and Dresden, long spared the bombers, suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. It was during this fevered interlude that I received the package. Not through official channels, those had long since frayed, but left on the depot's back step one morning, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. No return address. Inside, wrapped in newspaper from the Times, dated October 1944, was a small wooden box. Inside the box, a brass compass, its glass face cracked but its needle still true, and a folded slip of paper bearing a single sentence in English, typed on thin airmail stock. He walks under Scottish skies. Thank you. Beneath it, a hand-drawn map of the North Sea, with a dotted line from Sagan to Aberdeen, and a tiny anchor symbol near the coast. I stood in the empty storage bay, the compass cold in my palm, tears blurring the ink. They knew, not the Gestapo, not the Commandant, but them, the network, the men who had made it out. And one of them, perhaps Headley himself, had sent this not as proof but as acknowledgement. I buried the compass in the lining of my mattress that night, beneath the straw ticking, where only I would know it lay. Then, on February 13th, the sirens wailed just after 9. Not the practice drills we'd grown used to, but the long, rising and falling howl that meant inbound. We stumbled into the basement shelter of the depot, 30 of us huddled in the dark, listening to the distant throb of engines growing louder, closer, until the ground began to vibrate, not with the sharp crack of bombs, but with a deep, rolling thunder that shook dust from the ceiling joists. The first wave hit at 10:13 p.m., British Lancasters, over 800 of them, unloaded 1,478 tons of high explosives and 1,182 tons of incendiaries in just 22 minutes. The sky turned orange, then white, then black with smoke. When the all-clear finally sounded at dawn, Dresden was a furnace. The old town, Frauenkirche, Zwinger Palace, the narrow alleys where I'd walked after curfew, had vanished into a sea of rubble and flame. Over 25,000 were dead by morning, their bodies fused with molten glass and timber in cellars turned ovens. I emerged from the shelter into a world without sound, without color, without time, only ash falling like snow and the faint, acrid smell of burning hair. In the chaos that followed, orders dissolved. The depot was half collapsed, its records incinerated, its crates smoldering. I wandered the streets for 2 days, helping where I could, dragging bodies from collapsed tenements, passing canteens of melted snow to shell-shocked survivors, avoiding the SS patrols who shot looters on sight. On the third day, while sifting through the ruins of a pharmacy near the Taschenberg Palais, I found a half-melted typewriter, its keys warped but still legible. Taped beneath its carriage was a waterproof envelope. Inside, photographs, not of soldiers or weapons, but of faces. Men in RAF uniforms, standing on a windswept Scottish airfield, smiling beneath wool caps, arms slung over each other's shoulders. One of them was Headley, thinner, bearded, but unmistakable. On the back in pencil, Aberdeen, December 1944. All home. One owes his life to a guard who saw and chose not to see. I tucked the photos inside my tunic next to my heart and kept walking. The war was ending, but not cleanly. Columns of German troops retreated through the city, some orderly, most ragged, discarding weapons as they went. I shed my uniform one night in a burned-out tram depot, replacing it with the coat of a dead civilian. Brown wool, too large, one sleeve singed, and simply vanished into the tide of displaced persons. No one asked for papers. No one cared. I headed west. Not toward the American lines, but toward the Harz Mountains, where an uncle had once owned a forester's cabin. It was there, in a cabin with no electricity and a stone hearth, that I spent the spring of 1945 listening to the distant rumble of artillery and reading the news on a battery-powered radio salvaged from a crashed Ju-88. On May 7th, as the announcer's voice broke over the static, unconditional surrender, I did not cheer. I did not weep. I walked outside into the pine-scented air and stood beneath a sky cleared of bombers for the first time in years. And I thought of that breath rising from the mud in Sagan, and the shadow that had slipped into the trees, and the compass ticking softly beneath my mattress in a city turned to ash. The summer of 1945 smelled of wet earth and rotting apples. The Hart's cabin, nestled in a fold of spruce and moss-covered granite, had become my refuge, not by choice, but by exhaustion. The war had burned through everything else, leaving only silence and the slow regrowth of things that refused to die. I lived on wild berries, smoked trout from the mountain streams, and the occasional barter with a village farmer who asked no questions so long as I mended his fence or split wood. My uniform was buried beneath a cairn of river stones, and with it the name Erich Hoffmann, though I kept it in my mind like a fossil, something preserved but no longer alive. The world beyond the valley moved on in headlines I read only when passing through the nearest hamlet. Nuremberg trials, displaced persons camps, the partition of Germany. I avoided mirrors. The face that looked back would have reminded me too much of the man who once stood in a watchtower and chose silence over duty. But memory has its own gravity. One August afternoon, while gathering firewood near a creek bed, I found a piece of metal half buried in the silt. War debris, perhaps from a downed plane. It was smooth, curved, stamped with a faded serial number and the letters RAF. I turned it over in my hands, the sun warming its surface, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to think not of guilt or survival, but of consequence. What had become of the 76? Of the 50 executed? Of the 3 who made it to freedom? I remembered the photos from Dresden, the faces grinning under Scottish skies. They had lived. Because of a tunnel, because of forged papers, because of a guard who looked away. That single act, passive, almost invisible, had threaded into a chain of events that stretched across oceans and years. I had never considered myself part of history. I was a clerk, a watcher, a man who stamped papers and stood in the rain. Yet history, I realized, is not made only by generals and dictators. It is stitched together by glances withheld, by doors left ajar, by the quiet refusal to sound an alarm when the world demands it. Autumn brought news I could no longer ignore. A letter arrived at the village post office, addressed not to Erich Hoffmann, but to Der Wächter von Sagan, the guard of Sagan. The postmaster, an old man with milky eyes, handed it to me without comment, as if he'd been expecting it. Inside, on Ministry of Defence letterhead, was an inquiry from the British War Office. We are compiling a record of individuals who rendered assistance, however indirect, to Allied personnel during captivity. Your name has been noted in connection with the Stalag Luft III escape of March 1944. Please provide any recollection that may aid our historical documentation. No threat, no accusation. Just a request, dry and bureaucratic, yet carrying the weight of reckoning. I burned the letter in the hearth, but the words remained etched in my mind. They knew not everything, but enough, and they were not seeking punishment. They were seeking truth. I began to write. Not a confession, not a defense, but a record, ink on cheap paper, the same looping script I'd used to log boot shipments. I described the rain on the night of March 24th, the breath rising from the mud, the shadow moving like liquid, the 10 minutes I gave them before calling in a false disturbance near the western fence. I did not claim heroism. I did not ask for absolution. I simply stated what happened, as a witness might, as a man who saw something and chose to let it be. When the pages filled a notebook, I sealed them in an envelope and left it with the postmaster, addressed to the War Office in London. I did not sign it. But I included the brass compass from Aberdeen, its needle still pointing north, as proof that someone had walked free. Winter returned, harsher this time. Snow buried the trails, and the creek froze solid. I spent days reading tattered books salvaged from a bombed-out school, Goethe Dickens, a manual on bird-watching, and nights listening to the wind howl through the pines like a dirge for the dead. In February 1946, another letter came. this time bearing a London postmark and no official insignia. It was from a man named Charles P. Chaz Headley, formerly of 44 Squadron RAF. "Dear Sir or Madam," it began, "I do not know your name, but I owe you my life. After emerging from Harry, I walked for 3 nights through Silesian forests, guided only by stars and the compass you helped preserve. I crossed into Czechoslovakia with the help of a farmer who spoke no English, but fed me bread and hid me in his root cellar. From there I was passed through a network of priests, railway workers and school teachers, ordinary people who risked everything to say no to the machine. I reached Gibraltar in May. My wife had given birth to a son while I was in Sagan. I held him for the first time in June. None of this would have happened without the silence of a guard who saw me and chose to look away. The letter ended simply, "Thank you does not suffice, but it is all I have to give." I read it 10 times. Then I tucked it beneath the floorboards, next to the photos and the RAF scrap metal. By spring, I knew I could not stay hidden forever. The world was rebuilding, and even ghosts had to find a place in it. I walked into Göttingen in April 1946, registered under my real name for the first time in over a year, and took a job as a night clerk at a railway warehouse. Ironic, perhaps, but fitting. Trains again, paperwork again. But this time I was no longer a cog in a war machine. I was a man who filed invoices for coal shipments and watched the dawn break over the tracks. The same tracks that had once carried prisoners to camps and bombs to cities, and now carried milk, medicine, and letters between families, reassembling their shattered lives. One evening in June, while sorting manifests, I overheard 2 British officers, military historians. They said, discussing the Stalag Luft III escape over coffee in the station cafe. "The real mystery," one said, "is how 76 men got beyond the wire without a single guard raising the alarm in time. The logs show a delayed report from Tower 2, 10-minute gap, unexplained." His companion stirred sugar into his cup. "Probably just incompetence. Happened all the time toward the end." I kept my head down, stamping a crate of linseed oil bound for Hamburg. But inside something loosened. They would never know. The truth would remain in a sealed file in London, in a letter under floorboards, in the quiet pulse of a compass buried in memory. And that was as it should be. Innovation is praised. Strategy is studied. But the silent act of mercy, the glance averted, the alarm unrung, is rarely recorded. Yet it may be the only thing that keeps humanity from drowning in its own machinery. The decades passed, like freight trains in the night, rumbling through, leaving only vibration and the scent of coal in their wake. I remained in Göttingen, never marrying, never seeking promotion, content with the rhythm of ledgers, the clack of typewriter keys, and the slow accumulation of ordinary days. The warehouse became a post office, then a municipal archives annex, and I, by quiet consensus, its unofficial caretaker, a man who knew where every file belonged, who remembered which boiler needed stoking in November, who could silence a squeaky floorboard with a wedge of beechwood. My past receded, not erased, but folded into the grain of my being, like a letter sealed inside a book no one would ever open. I read the histories as they emerged, the memoirs of RAF officers, the documentaries about the Great Escape, the annual commemorations at the Stalag Luft III Memorial in Jagan. They spoke of Bushell's brilliance, of the tunnel's engineering, of the 50 murdered in cold blood. But never of the guard, never of the 10 minutes of silence that allowed the first man to vanish into the trees. And I did not correct them. Truth does not always need a witness to exist. In 1972, a BBC film crew came to Göttingen researching wartime logistics. One of them, a young researcher with round glasses and ink-stained fingers, asked if I'd served during the war. "A little," I said, and offered him tea. He showed me photographs of Stalag Luft III, barracks rebuilt as a museum, the tunnel entrances marked with plaques. "They say the earth absorbed Harry so completely that even today, ground-penetrating radar can't find the full route," he mused, "as if the land itself wanted to protect their secret." I nodded, stirring honey into my cup. "Some things," I said, "are meant to stay hidden." He looked at me strangely, as if sensing a depth he couldn't map, but pressed no further. Before he left, he handed me a brochure for the memorial. On the back, in small print, was a list of the 76 escapees. Hedley's name was there with a footnote. Repatriated May 1944, died 1998, aged 89. Survived by 3 children, 7 grandchildren. I kept the brochure on my desk for years, the paper yellowing at the edges, a silent anchor to a moment I'd never speak of aloud. The real reckoning came not from outsiders, but from within. In 1985, during a heatwave that baked the cobblestones white, I received a visitor, an elderly man with a Scottish accent and a walking stick carved from birch. He introduced himself as Alasdair MacLeod, former navigator with 97 Squadron, shot down over Berlin in 1943, imprisoned at Stalag Luft III from November 1943 to April 1944. He'd been too junior to join the escape, but had helped dig Harry's shoring, passing sandbags hand to hand in the dark. I heard a rumour, he said, sitting in my small garden under the linden tree, that a guard on Tower 2 saw one of the first men out but didn't sound the alarm, that he bought them those crucial minutes. He paused, sipping the lemonade I'd made. I've spent 40 years wondering if that's true. Not to accuse, just to thank. I looked at my hands, veined, spotted, the nails thickened with age, and for the first time I did not deflect. It's true, I said quietly. I saw him, and I turned away. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and placed a small object on the garden table, a replica of the wooden horse used in an earlier escape attempt at the camp, carved from a single block of oak. Then this, he said, is for you. Not as a trophy, as a testament. I kept it on my windowsill until the end. By the 1990s, the world had moved on to newer wars, newer horrors. But in quiet moments, while feeding pigeons in the marktplatz, while listening to rain on the roof, while watching school children pass on their way to class, I would think of that night in Sagan, not with pride, not with shame, but with a kind of solemn clarity. The war had taught me that institutions are blind to what they refuse to see, that expertise often mistakes consensus for truth, that the most powerful acts of resistance are not grand declarations, but infinitesimal refusals, a withheld report, a delayed alarm, a glance turned aside. And that, sometimes, saving one life ripples outward in ways no ledger can tally, through children born, books written, kindnesses paid forward in a chain stretching far beyond the horizon of intention. I died in my sleep on a crisp November morning in 2003 at the age of 80. The obituary in the Göttinger Tageblatt called me a retired civil servant, known for his quiet demeanor and meticulous record-keeping. No mention of Sagan, no mention of war, only that I'd left my modest estate to a local youth literacy program, a detail I'd stipulated in my will, along with instructions that a small wooden box be sent to the Imperial War Museum in London. Inside, they found the RAF metal scrap, the photos from Aberdeen, Hedley's letter, and the brass compass, its needle still true after 60 years. They catalogued it under anonymous donation, Stalag Luft III related materials, accession number IWM 2003-1147. It sits in a climate-controlled drawer today, unseen by most, known only to archivists and the occasional researcher tracing the hidden arteries of wartime courage. And so the story ends, not with fanfare, but with silence, the same silence that once covered a man's escape through the rain. For history remembers the tunnels, the names, the executions, but it forgets the guard who stood on the tower, heart pounding, finger hovering over the alarm, and chose, in the suffocating weight of that moment, to let the earth keep its secret. And perhaps that is as it should be, for the deepest truths are not carved in stone or broadcast on radio waves. They are whispered into the mud, carried on the breath of those who walk free, and held in the quiet spaces between what is said and what is known. In a world obsessed with monuments, the most enduring legacy may be the one that leaves no trace, except in the lives it allowed to continue, unseen, undisturbed, and whole.